Welcome back to Business Security Weekly, episode number 72. This next interview segment is really important to me. This is one that we've been working on for a little while. I think as most people know, over the last few months after I left Tenable, I decided to take some time off, kind of figure out what I wanted to do, where I wanted to go, and I got a really great opportunity to spend time with Layered Insight, really helping them through kind of identifying, their long-term strategy. And so with us today, we have Asif Awan, our founder and chief technology officer. Asif, welcome to Security Weekly.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. Thanks for your time, guys.
Yeah. So Asif, on this show, we always like to talk about the business problem. What is the problem that technology companies are trying to solve? So I would love you to walk us through the problem that Layered Insight's trying to solve, that really starts to set up, why should somebody look at container security and obviously Layered Insight.
Absolutely. So over 2 years ago, Matt, when we started the company around end of 2015, that was the year when containers were starting to take off and get adopted, starting to be taken seriously by enterprises, and they were getting adopted both at the application layer, as I call it, as well as on the infrastructure layer. Meaning applications, the typical monolithic applications were getting broken down into microservices or getting containerized, as well as the infrastructure was also starting to include containers in them. The aha moment, so to speak, for me was that when you look at containers, right, the key difference between a container and a regular host, as well as a VM, is that containers do not include an execution environment in them. So none of the host-based or the network-based security solutions and the visibility solutions would work for containers. And that particular starting point has been proven right in the past 2 years or so, as dedicated container-specific deep visibility as well as security or the protection solution offerings are being developed and have come about.
Yeah, and in this,
so I just want to say that was the weirdest part for me when I first started playing around with containers, and I looked at all the processes in the host system, and I'm like, wait a minute, those are processes in my containers. I was just like totally, but Asif said it correctly, that execution's still happening on the host, which when you think of it from a traditional like Linux Unix person like I am, I was blown away by that. I'm like, this is weird. And then the next thought, right, in our collective heads was, how do I secure that?
Right. And that's one of the big challenges, I think, in the space, and we've talked about it on some of the other shows, is that how do you take a traditional security approach, which is what everybody's trying to do, and apply it to containers? Well, it doesn't really map that way. So, Asif, can you walk us through some of the different approaches that people have started to take when it comes to container security, and then, kind of the pros and cons of those different approaches? Because I think it's important for people to understand that difference. No operating system means no host-based agent. So now what?
Absolutely. There are three broad categories that you can put the container protection solutions that are being offered by different vendors. The first one is that of taking the legacy host-based agent approach, and I would like to use the term force fitting it to apply to the container world, so to speak, right? So what it means is that basically it is referred to as a kernel plugin or a kernel module based approach. All you do is you install a kernel module, all right, and this kernel module is the one through which you get you are able to intercept all the network traffic as well as the system calls, and you try to make certain security decisions. The second category of the applications or the solutions that are being offered to protect containers is referred to as the security container based approach. But what it really is that it requires running that agent which was previously being run on the host into something called a privileged container. As you can imagine, if you're putting an agent in a privileged in a container that is running alongside the application containers, what happens is that in order for this container that is running the agent to be able to intercept the traffic and take a peek into what is happening into the other application containers, it required certain privileges. Hence the name privileged containers. So it requires Linux capabilities. It requires root privileges. So it's basically what it means is you are as somebody who is managing the applications or the containerized application is adding root privilege or Linux capabilities to the user space that is exposed to the outside world. So those are the implications from a security point of view. I can obviously get into the details with respect to the performance implications and so on. And the third approach is the approach that we take, which is referred to as the layered in or the embedded security approach. The beautiful thing about the approach that we take is that all the visibility and the security resides within the boundaries of the containers. What that means is we take a container image and we create a secure version of that image. So wherever that image is run or the instances of that image is run, basically you get deep visibility as well as the protection. So which means it has it is zero touch to the developers as well as it offers you infinite portability, because wherever you take the containers, the deep visibility as well as security just seamlessly moves with it.
So a question, if it's not an agent inside of the container, what's different and what's inside of that container? I think of it like a hook, but for those listening, like what is that?
You use the right term. It is basically a hook. For those in your audience who are, I'm sure, Paul, you're very familiar with the application performance monitoring space, the ones that are offered by the likes of New Relic and App Dynamics and so on. So they take a similar kind of approach, but the intent there is different. So again, you take a regular image, a container image, and let's just call it through our magical approach, we create an instrumented version of it. And in doing so, we put the hooks so that all system calls, all network calls, all IO calls, and anything and everything that is happening in the higher level language layers is all captured in order to create a 360-degree, what we refer to as a behavior profile, specific to each container and specific to the code that is running in each container.
So it's almost like a shim, because the container is essentially an application. All the things that it does has to go into the host or in through the Docker server or whatever. You're kind of in between.
Right. So there's
layer.
a number of dependencies in the container itself that allow the containers to run. So by injecting and hooking into that layer right before that kind of final dependency, you can now see all the network, all the storage, all the application calls right from within the container, not requiring any root access to the underlying infrastructure, which is how the other approaches do it.
Exactly. That's the key point, that by taking this particular approach, the entire solution still runs in the user space, And if you take a small step back, the primary reason, one of the primary reasons containers are being massively adopted by the enterprises is that as an enterprise, what is it that you would like to own? Or what is it that you own? Primarily, the starting point is that you own the data, the business data. And in most cases, you also own the application payload. Enterprises want to move away from owning and managing the underlying infrastructure layer. Earlier, that underlying infrastructure layer, be it in the private cloud or in the public cloud, was based on VMs. Now it is based on containers. So if you take any of these first two approaches that I talked about, which is that of installing a kernel plugin or installing a privileged container, what you're doing is you're going back and creating the dependencies on the underlying infrastructure, thereby having to own it. And just to further elaborate with an example, if you go to Google or GCP and ask them for let's just say a farm of containers. So they give you containers or something called a Google or Container Optimized OS or COS. If at all you would like to install any kernel plugins in that, the service level agreement that you have with them is completely different. They do not allow a kernel plugin to be installed in the COS or the Container Optimized OS. They give you an Ubuntu image and tell you do whatever you want.
Changes the way these new applications, which are really built for high speed and agility and portability, it really impacts how how much of that portability you're going to get if you're really tying yourself back into that underlying infrastructure, because EKS, Kubernetes Managed Service in AWS, right? We're seeing customers move there as they announce those, and so now by not having any of those underlying hooks, customers can build in any environment, move it into a container as a service or even serverless backend functions, and not have to change their security products. Any of the other solutions, because of those underlying hooks, now you're kind of stuck to the infrastructure a little bit, so they have to be re-architected.
Mm-hmm. Guys, when we look at this, who in the enterprise today is trying to solve this? Because I'm kind of tired of people saying, "Oh, nobody cares about security." I think everybody cares about security, but it doesn't mean they know what to do with it. So who are you seeing adopt the containers, and are they already looking like, have they kind of had the same conclusion that Paul had of, oh, this is different, how do I secure it? Or are you finding that you have to help people understand it a little bit different? Because we're pretty ahead of the curve on this one, right?
Yeah, we are.
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent question. So 2 years ago when we started, right? I mean, as was the case with the VMs, it was primarily the developers, right? More so with containers, it's the developers who started adopting and started tinkering with it, started playing it, right? But eventually there was a huge gap between, okay, the developers packaging the applications in the form of containers and the deployment, which was still whatever old VM-based deployment, So that was one of the things, one of the early challenges that the enterprises faced in terms of having to bridge that gap. And the good thing is that in the past year or year and a half, the CI/CD or the continuous integration and deployment pipelines have, again, with help from container as a service providers, have adopted the containers as part of the development as well as the deployment cycle very seamlessly. Now, to answer the second part of your question about who cares about security, it's basically, I mean, it's the traditional security guys, obviously, the SecOps guys obviously care about security. But now the interesting implication of these slipstreaming of containers throughout the entire CI/CD pipeline, what has happened is that there is zero tolerance for security delaying that pipeline in any way, okay? And what I mean by that is security is still important, like you said, it is required, but at the same time, there is no flexibility or no, like I said, tolerance in terms of slowing down the process to do some manual inspection of container images for any vulnerabilities, as an example, or manually creating the notifications if certain images were to fail the compliance check, all right? Or handcrafting the policies that need to go with each and every containers when those container instances are running, right? So it is very interesting that when we started the company, and since then, right from the very first meeting, from the demos that we give to the potential customers, it's not just the security guys or the security architects who are involved in the decision making or the evaluation process, but it's also the DevOps architects. It's also the application architects. So basically, all the application owners, the DevOps guys, as well as the SecOps guys, all are making the decision collectively so as to ensure that A, it is zero touch to the developer, the security and visibility solution. It is minimal or zero touch to the DevOps guys, and it seamlessly integrates with the CI/CD pipeline, and it is as automated as possible to the SecOps guys with a very low false positive and false negative, because we are talking about the security solutions here.
So I guess if I were to play devil's advocate for a second, and because I can see people going, well, I'm going to adopt DevOps, I'm going to implement this containerized services, I'm going to build security into my process. And oh, by the way, if I mess something up, I can use these orchestration tools and I can roll out a fix. So why do I need to add another security layer on top of all that?
That's a good question.
You want me to take that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So that's an excellent question, right? So the way I look at it, taking a small step back, right? All what Docker provides, or container, let me generalize it, the container orchestration layer or the container lifecycle management vendors or solutions provide, like container as a service, is what I refer to as table stake security. Okay, so basically you get authentication, you get access control, right? Because obviously Docker runs as root. So who has access to that engine, or who has access to the host? They provide basic capabilities from a security point of view, like a fixed sandbox, right? Now I'm getting into the technical details, but Docker has something called seccom profiles, right? But in terms of making it seamless for the security guys and making it automated, that is not the purpose that these solutions, or whatever table stake security features that Docker and Kubernetes provide, address. And what I mean by that is, let's say with Docker seccom profile, you'd still have to, as a SecOps guy, create multiple different sandboxes. And guess what? You still don't get the flexibility of being able to change those sandboxes on the fly when those container instances are running. You would have to bring them down if at all any changes need to be made to the sandbox profiles, and then have to relaunch the container. Same is the case with Kubernetes. The kind of security policies that they provide are ingress and egress, right? If you're alluding to, Paul, probably you're alluding to some of the things that are happening in the open source community with respect to Istio and stuff. If that is the question, I can get into the next level of details.
I would imagine some of the extra functionality is not just in the configuration and deployment, but understanding some of the indicators of compromise that happen in your container environment. And for me, when I design a Docker container environment, I know I've got containers, I've got file systems, I've got a network, and the infrastructure can be secure, but I don't know like what happens when someone compromises my container, and
right.
And how do I get those indicators? So how have you approached that problem of like, what are some of the indicators, and how does that funnel into someone who's got to respond to that incident?
Right. You wanna...
Absolutely. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples, Paul. So as an example, right, let's say you have an application, all right? In the normal scheme of things, it doesn't spawn off a shell. So when layered inside solution, all right, the protection solution, when it creates a behavior profile, obviously the aspect that the application code running within the container should not be spawning off shells is automatically captured, and based on which security policies are created. Now, in the enforcement mode, let's just say that for whatever reason, one of the processes running within the container starts spawning off shell, or starts forking off processes at a very rapid rate because it has been compromised and it is trying to launch a denial of service attack, or it is trying to establish connections to the IP addresses, internal or external, that it is not supposed to be doing that. It is trying to write binaries in let's say, user bin or read-only locations, or it is trying to launch processes with binaries that are not whitelisted or that were not observed as part of the normal behavior. All of those indicators are the ones, I'm just giving a handful of examples, are the ones that are captured by layered inside protection solution, and then they are raised, and through the integration with existing threat intelligence platforms, or through the remediation that we ourselves support, meaning the layered inside solution supports, those remediations could be applied. As an example, if a process is trying to fork off a shell, it could just be prevented. And this is where I just would like to add before I stop, is that this is why we refer to our solution, Paul, as one that is a preemptive one rather than a reactive one. And what I mean by that is, let's say if there is a call, because we intercept and sit in line all the system calls, if our solution sees a network bind attempt happening on a port that the process is not supposed to bind to, that call will not go through, all right? We are not talking about that call going through and then the compromised process putting the network traffic and the network traffic getting picked up from the wire, and then the deep packet inspection, the decisions being made. So there are a lot of performance enhancement that you get from that point of view as well, compared to the other security solutions.
It's interesting. I can see folks being somewhat kind of complacent with, oh, I've done this container thing and I've added a security layer and now I'm good. My concern is, what about the unknowns? Because I think largely the security community the evil bad guys, right, haven't really looked at, like, how do I attack this infrastructure? We've only seen a very small percentage, in my opinion, of the attacks that I think we're going to see.
Agreed.
And so what, I mean, you guys are the experts in this area. What are your thoughts on what might we see in the future, and what tools do we have we can develop to combat those?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I'll let Asif go
ahead.
first. No, I got a couple other thoughts on this one, but I'll let you go first.
So one of the beautiful things, trends that is being adopted in the context of container ecosystem, Paul, is that of immutable infrastructure. And it seems not so obvious, but when you think about containers, right? Anything and everything that an application or an application module, or be it a microservice, that it needs for the rest of its journey, when it is all packaged together, guess what happens to the underlying infrastructure? It becomes very simple and very thin, and hence immutable. In fact, people have written, security experts have written articles saying that in the context of Spectre and Meltdown, right? Of course, those attacks could not have been prevented, and as you and I know very, very well, but the patching of the infrastructure would have become much, much simpler if people were to adopt immutable infrastructure. All right. So that is one key point. The immutable infrastructure, keeping it thin, keeping it simple, is very, very important. And then the key aspect of immutability goes back to not installing and not having to maintain and manage it, meaning not having installing the kernel plugins, or any of the modules. Just keep it simple, keep it immutable, and rip and replace, whenever any upgrades need to be done. That is one key point. The second point is that now when you're talking about containers, right? Mapping the intra-app and inter-app network communication topologies among containers, that is an important point. So the simple thing is, again, it is being referred to as a network microsegmentation in the context of containers, but in security, as we know, is all about reducing the attack surface. So removing all the system calls that the code that is running within the container doesn't need significantly reduces the attack surface. Removing or not allowing the container, a particular container, to listen on a particular port that it is not supposed to, or prevent it from establishing an outgoing connection that it is not supposed to, again, significantly reduces the attack that, if that container were to get compromised, would launch on the other containers. Be it of the same application or the other application. So these are all, we know that it is a cat and mouse game, right? Between the good and the bad guys, so to speak. So all we have to do is, again, the standard principles of defense in depth, breaking it down into various different points of enforcement, and enforcing it closest to where the data is, and what better point to enforce the security policies automatically than within the application, which always sees the data in the clear.
What I love, and we talked about this last night, one of the penetration testers was saying that, we had a really frustrating client in that we gained access for about an hour, and that's the most amount of time we were able to keep that connection. With the container world, it might be a lot less than that.
Might be a lot less.
You can just redeploy, even if you haven't fixed the vulnerability, only giving a small window to the attacker to say, oh yeah, you got shell again. Okay, here's a new environment, start over. That's going to be, as Asif said, a really interesting cat and mouse game that we're going to play with attackers.
Yeah, and in the broader sense, behavior drives the policies and the security policies. So if we can understand through unit testing what the application's normal behavior looks like, and then enforce a policy in place, then it gives us the ability to prevent abnormal behavior, which are all these unknown attacks we don't know what's coming yet, right? And so by being inside the container with a set
what I like about that is, it's the problems I think we've had in understanding what's normal in its most extreme sense is we said, okay, you've got a network of 50,000 hosts. I'm going to look at all the networks and systems, and I'm going to understand what's normal. In this case, what's awesome is you've got a web server that's separate from your app server, that's separate from your database, that's separate from your file system. And oh, by the way, the network has been constructed to only connect the pieces that need to be connected. Now, when you profile that, it's on a micro scale,
right?
And you can be more accurate with it.
Way more accurate, because now we're only looking at the individual container. So each one of these policies is specific to the container image, which now allows us to do much better enforcement than I think we could ever attempt to do in a much broader
I like that.
architecture.
Because it helps me with troubleshooting today. It helps me with performance today, because I can really only tune these containers to exactly what I need. I'd never really considered how much of a security benefit it is to have each piece of my application, and then a whole set of applications with multiple pieces, all in those individual little buckets.
Exactly.
I like it.
And that's just a completely different way of thinking about it. And that's where, the approach was so unique. It's something, when I was at Tenable, we had talked about aspects of the container market, and, the FlawCheck acquisition kind of really made us think about what was next. What was interesting when I met with the Layered Insight guys was we had the same thought process. Don't try to do this from the outside. Outside security of the application's been tough from day one. How do we do it inside? And they were actually building the product for almost a year and a half when we met, which was really awesome to kind of see that concept actually come to life and actually working in different clients. So, it was a testament to Asif and the team of what they did, but I think it is the much more effective way to think about how do we secure these next generation applications. We got to really think differently than we've done in the past.
That's one of the things that I've enjoyed about this conversation, and part of what we're trying to do on this program in particular is looking at some of those innovation things, so that if you're a security leader today and you're trying to get your head wrapped around it, there's a lot here to think about.
Yeah.
And this
That's
is the kind of thing where this gets you ahead of it. Matt, I mean, obviously, you've done a good job with us this week talking about how to think about some of these things. So if somebody wants to learn more, where do they go?
Well, they go to layeredinsight.com. From there, you can kind of look at our different solutions and products that help solve what we see as the core challenges in this space. It's really understanding what's in the container image itself. It's understanding what's happening when the container is running, and then how do I enforce that behavior and protect it at the runtime. To us, those are the three key areas that people are struggling with, and that's really where we're focusing our focus.
Yeah, and since you play that cool dual role of host on the network, part of the family, and working with Layered Insight, what I like too is you're pretty upfront that you're working to educate people. Obviously you've got a solution that you believe in, but what I like too is you are taking time to say, nope, here's how to think about it, here's the problem, here's the approach. And I personally respect that, because what I've learned listening to you guys today, right, being the dumb guy in the middle of all the smart brains, is wow, there's a lot here to start wrapping our heads around. So
absolutely,
it's exciting stuff.
I had to tinker with Docker for 8 or 9 months to be able to ask some of those questions.
I think I have a pair of Dockers. That's about as close as I got to it so far.
All right, you any final thoughts, Asif?
Yeah, I mean, just one final thing. I mean, going back to what you were mentioning about the inside out versus the outside in approach. The outside in approach, it still has the issues that despite running with all the privileges and such, it still has to play man in the middle for traffic that could already be encrypted. And this is where probably this is for another discussion at some other time. But things like or solutions like Istio are catching a lot of steam in the context of Kubernetes. But when you start looking at it from a security point of view, there are still a lot of challenges, and that particular architecture in the context of service mesh or the microservices mesh still cannot be used for the kind of value or for the kind of challenges and problems that we are trying to address through Layered Insight. Just wanted to add that last thought.
All right. And with that, thank you, Asif, for joining us. Well, great interview segment. And we'll take a break and come back with the news.